Sí.
Muy bien.
Okay.
¿En inglés o en español? En inglés, okay. My name is Asiel. I am a non-binary Latinx person. I was born in Mexico and I'm currently a medical practitioner in the western suburbs of Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's enough representation of Latinx people in Australia in general, and much less of non-binary Latinx people in general, kind of within the community. So I thought it would be a really great opportunity to show how proud I am of my non-binary identity and how proud I am to celebrate my Latinx community as well. The reason why we came to Australia was a bit of a twist of fate, really. My father was an engineer. We came roughly when I was about 17. We were looking for job opportunities outside of Mexico at the time, and my dad said, there's this opportunity to work in Melbourne. Would you like to come along? Obviously my mom, my dad and my sister knowing it was going to be a really huge kind of trip to the other side of the world, really. We didn't have no idea what Australia was like. We had very little idea of what Melbourne was like. We thought it was going to be like the United States, but perhaps in a smaller scale. That was kind of our perception around things, but we really had no idea. So we just kind of looked at Wikipedia, thought it looked pretty, and decided to come along. And 10 years later, we're still here. So yeah.
Yes.
My hopes and dreams tend to be a little bit kind of multi-layered, really. I think if I were to speak from the pure sense of my hopes and dreams, really my hopes and dreams would be to go back to Mexico and in reality to be accepted as a non-binary person and feel safe presenting how I want to present in Mexico and in my hometown. The violence that the country is going through to subside, so I feel like it is a safe place to go back into. There's always this kind of tension on one hand of setting a home here but knowing that home is also elsewhere. So even though we've been in Australia for such a long time, I think a huge part of me still very much misses Mexico. And a lot of my gender identity and how I choose to kind of present myself is very much to bridge that gap, really, to celebrate kind of my Mexican heritage and to celebrate the women that kind of brought me up and the women that were within Mexican culture who did so much, and reject a lot of the, let's say, masculinity and machismo and all of those kind of places of violence that a lot of kind of Latinx people grew up with. So ironically enough, I think my biggest hope and dreams is to go back to Mexico and kind of leave Australia. Whether or not that's realistic will be yet to find out. I suppose within Australia, I'm very lucky in that I have a very comfortable life. Luckily, I came in a time when it was a lot easier to process a lot of things like, residency and citizenship, and because it was done with my father, we just kind of had to go through the process, and I didn't suffer any major adversity through getting citizenship, and it allowed me to study here in Australia, and it opened a whole lot of doors that I think would have been very difficult otherwise, and that I'm sure I would be unable to do if we had stayed back in Mexico. Within Australia, I'm very fortunate to have a very nice stable career that I love going to work kind of every day. It's something that I'm really passionate about. It's something that I think the LGBTI community in general needs a lot more of. And I have my partner here as well, who also has a very fortunate kind of upbringing and background. So I suppose my alternate kind of hopes and dreams is to continue fostering that, continue fostering kind of the Latinx community here, so we are a bit more visible and making those connections, because I think once I meet another kind of queer Latinx person, it's just like, it's kind of a bit of home here in Australia. So I do hope that the community continues to grow. In terms of kind of the difficulties of being kind of both queer and Latinx, I almost feel like I have to deal with one thing at a time. And in Mexico, for me, even the thought about being queer didn't really enter my head until we moved out of Mexico, really. And I got to kind of experience the LGBTI community here in Australia, and a lot of things kind of made sense. But for a really long time within the kind of LGBTI community, I felt there was a big sense of it's either I'm queer or I'm Mexican, and it's either or, and it's never kind of both together. So kind of within queer spaces, you know, was often confronted with racism or with people not quite understanding what Mexican culture was about, or with kind of really ignorant comments around what was it like to kind of grow up in Mexico. I never got to listen to the music that I wanted to listen to, you know, within queer spaces. I never got to share, you know, those really unique things that are within our language that you know, really kind of separate your identities into two separate bits. It's either this or that. And it took a really long time, I think, while I was kind of coming to terms with my sexuality and kind of in my earlier years, I felt very separated from my Mexican identity. And I think that was a huge detriment. It created a sense of shame where in reality there shouldn't be any shame. When I was within Latinx spaces and whenever I spoke to other kind of Mexican people and whenever kind of we went back home, I felt like I always had to go back in the closet, and it was never, sexuality was something that was never kind of spoken about, much less gender identity. So it really kind of separated the two. It didn't feel like I could kind of be these two things together at the same time. And it wasn't really until kind of through a lot of soul searching and talking to other people kind of within the Latinx community, going back through our own heritage as well and identifying some of the queer history that has always been kind of within our Mexican communities, our Mexican cultures. You know, we have two kind of queer women in our bills. We have Frida Kahlo in the 500 and we have Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in the 200, and they're, you know, kind of queer icons that are very publicly acknowledged in Mexico, but at the same time it's not something that's kind of very commonly spoken about. At the end of all of that, I think my gender identity was what kind of came out of it, and saying this is a space where you can hold both your queerness and your culture and celebrate both of those things and embrace both of those things and show yourself in your, you know, most authentic. And it was a tough kind of journey to kind of get here, but at the end of it, there's nothing that I would trade about, you know, being both queer and Latinx. I think there's a very unique joy in that intersection there that I don't think the queer community gets to experience, and at the same time I don't think the straight community in kind of Mexico gets to experience. So I'm grateful for kind of going through all of those adversities, despite the difficulties that they brought. Yeah, let me think about that for a second. I think a lot of people are a little bit unsure of kind of what my gender identity is, because on the one hand I can be very kind of masculine presenting, but on the other hand I can obviously be very gender non-conforming. And I think really it comes down to trying to celebrate all the strong women that were in my life. And, you know, kind of growing up in Mexico, I felt like I could never fulfill this idea of masculinity, and for me I think masculinity was a kind of a strong really place of violence where I never really identified with any of the masculine figures. I never really identified with any of the kind of historical figures that have celebrated machismo throughout Mexican culture. It was just something that didn't quite, you know, it just didn't fit in my head, and it's not something that I saw myself going into. However, when I think about all the women and all the female historical figures that have represented Mexican culture and identity, there's something that speaks to me very strongly there. Both kind of balance of femininity, softness, and strength at the same time, that really, you know, just encapsulates a lot of what I'm like. I guess in a way my gender identity very much comes from that place, from trying to embrace that very Latinx femininity. And the other thing is that, like, masculine dress code for Latinx people is just so boring. But usually female presenting people are the ones who wear the, you know, really beautiful dresses and the really beautiful skirts and the really beautiful makeup and the really bright flowers, and I absolutely am in love with all of that. And I think it's such a fantastic way of getting to celebrate both. So I guess if I could have a chat with everyone that walks down the street and kind of is wondering what that whole thing is about, it really comes from a place of joy and from trying to let them know that I'm, you know, very much Mexican, very much Latinx, but at the same time, you know, very queer and gender non-conforming and non-binary, and all of these things kind of rolled up in one. So yeah, the three words that kind of come to mind the most is non-binary, Mexican, migrant. So, no.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you,
was
very
amazing.
welcome. Oh, I'm very glad. I'm glad you.